This video is going to cover the body systems and health topic, and specifically the digestive system part of that topic. So previously, the video we talked about before was talking about the respiratory system, which is talking about the lungs and how oxygen is taken into the body. This one will now talk about the digestive system and how the food is brought into the body and into the blood particularly. So generally you'll have heard of the digestive system in terms of just digesting your food, which is exactly what that does. So digestion is what's known as the breakdown of food, and specifically it's the breakdown of what's known as large insoluble molecules into what's known as small soluble ones. Now, insoluble basically means things that cannot dissolve. So if you think about a whole Big Mac or a whole burger, if you tried to get that into your blood, it would not dissolve. It's too large. It needs to be broken down first. Okay, so insoluble molecules cannot dissolve and therefore they can't go into your blood. But if you break them down through the process of digestion, you can make them much smaller and therefore you make them soluble, which means that they'll dissolve in the blood. Okay, so digestion is a breakdown of food. So the whole purpose of digestion is to get that large insoluble food much smaller so that it can then be absorbed, and it allows that digested food to be absorbed into the blood. Now when it's absorbed into the blood, it can be transported around the body. So if you think about the circulatory system stuff we talked about in the very first part of this topic, that blood then transports a whole bunch of things. Specifically, it transports digested food, and it transports that digested food to the body cells, where it then uses it, and it uses it for energy. So without digestion breaking down these large insoluble molecules into small soluble ones, you wouldn't be able to then absorb that food into the blood, and therefore your cells would not get the food it needs to make energy. Now your body has a full organ system to be able to digest that food, so you'll need to be able to know the parts of it and then what each of those do. So I'm going to move a diagram onto the screen just now, and you're going to need to be able to label all of the parts of this and then what they do. So it's a very basic diagram, and it's obviously not to scale, so the mouth is not the same size as your stomach, but it will show the basics of what you need to know. So this up at the top here is where digestion starts. This is your mouth. Now the purpose of the mouth in digestion is to break down food, and it breaks it down mechanically, so it's not chemically, it just mashes it together. So it mechanically breaks down food. Now your mouth also has an organ in it called the tongue, which will help to mash that food around and help to break it down and form it into a ball that you can swallow. So once that mouth has mechanically broken down that food and it's mashed it all up into smaller parts, what that food then does is it passes down your gullet. Now if you put your hand just on the front of your throat and you swallow, you can feel the push of that gullet. Now, that gullet is behind that windpipe at the front, but it pushes so muscularly because it's pushing that food right down towards the stomach. So this tube here is the gullet. Now that gullet will connects the mouth to the stomach, and therefore it passes food from the mouth to the stomach. Now if you follow the food down from the mouth, down that gullet, you'll see it then passes into this organ here. So this organ is the stomach. Now your stomach is essentially just a big bag, and it's got two bits at the end called sphincters, at the front and at the end, that will then close off that stomach, and it'll let it squeeze and move food around about it. Now it squeezes and it moves food around so that it can mix that food. And it mixes food with the liquids that are in your stomach. Now if you think already about what you might know about what's in the stomach, you might know that your stomach has acid in it. So it mixes food with acid, which is why sometimes you can maybe get heartburn, which is where you get some of that acid reflux up into the gullet and you can feel it burning. So it mixes food with acid, and that helps to break it down. And it also mixes food with a chemical or a number of chemicals called enzymes. You know, those enzymes are chemicals that will help break down that food. So when you mix acid and enzymes with that food, you help to break it down. Okay, so once that food is then passed from that stomach, it's been mixed with the acid and the enzymes in the stomach, it passes down this tube and it passes behind this front one into this very, very narrow, thin tube. Now that narrow, thin tube is what's known as the small intestine. Now that small intestine, when you look at it, it doesn't look that small because it's actually very, very long. It's very, very long and very, very folded. It's called the small intestine because it's narrower, so it's a smaller tube in the inside of it, whereas the large intestine is much wider. Okay, so that small intestine is where all the magic happens, really, where the main part of digestion happens in terms of what the purpose of it is. So if the whole point of digestion is to absorb digested food to get into the blood, this is where that happens. Okay, so the small intestine absorbs digested food. So all that food that's been broken down gets absorbed here. And it gets absorbed specifically into the blood. Okay, so all that sugar that you take in, or the carbohydrates that get broken down into sugar, or fats and proteins, they all get broken down and then they get absorbed into the blood when they're in that small intestine. Now once you've taken all the useful stuff out in the small intestine, you then reach the large intestine, which is this one here. Now it's known as the large intestine because it's much wider than the small intestine, but it's actually shorter than the small intestine. Okay, this actually is much, much, much longer than this large intestine. It just looks a bit different in this diagram. So all that digested food has been absorbed into the blood, and what's left over is undigested food and then a bunch of water. So basically what you want to do is absorb excess water, any leftover water from that undigested food. Okay, now that takes all that excess water away, so what you're left with is basically just a whole bunch of undigested food that then needs to get released from the body. So before it gets released, it's stored temporarily because you don't want to constantly be releasing undigested food out of your body. So it gets stored in a place called the rectum. And that's purpose, that's job, that's function, is to store undigested food. Okay, or undigested waste. And it stores them as what's called feces. So feces is basically a fancy term for waste, right? Or a fancy term for poo. Right, so once that undigested waste that's been stored as feces in the rectum, right, is ready to be released, it's then released through the very last part of the digestive system, which is called the anus. So that's where feces exit the body. Okay, so I want to then follow the path of that food. Okay, so if we say that I've got, maybe use a red pen for this. Say that I've got a mouthful of hamburger, for example. It gets broken up in the mouth. Okay, so it starts off here, and then it travels down the gullet. Okay, so I've mechanically mashed it up in the mouth. It's then passing down the gullet from the mouth to the stomach, and it goes to the stomach where it gets mixed about with acid and with enzymes. Okay, and that will help to break that down even more. Now once it's broken down more, it's released in the stomach and it passes into this next part, that this next part is your small intestine. So it passes all the way through the small intestine, and what that small intestine does then is it absorbs all the useful stuff out of that. It absorbs all the digested food that your body wants to pass in the blood. Okay, so it absorbs that digested food into the blood. Now, once you've absorbed that digested food, what you're left with is undigested waste or undigested food. Okay, so I'm going to call it undigested waste here. And that undigested waste is passed into the large intestine, and then it passes around that large intestine. Okay, and all the while as it passes through that large intestine absorbs water from it. Now once it's absorbed all that excess water and it gets to the end of this tube, it enters what's called the rectum, where it sits and is ready basically to be excreted whenever your body is ready to do that. Okay, so whenever you're near a bathroom. So it stores that undigested waste as feces in the rectum. And whenever you're ready to go to the bathroom and you're ready to release that feces, it exits the body out of this anus here. Now you might have noticed a wee extra part. Now this wee extra part here, some people tend to point out, and that is where your appendix is. So your appendix is basically where your small intestine and your large intestine join. So sometimes you get infection in that, which can then mean that it gets much, much larger and can burst. Okay, it's not actually used in digestion, but it's just a wee extra part. Now in the other diagram that you've got in your PowerPoints, there's another diagram, another part of it that sits over the top over here. And that just shows the liver, but you won't need to know what that liver is. Okay, so you won't need to label that in a diagram. Okay, so in a test or in your homework, you'll need to be able to label these parts and then tell me what they do. Now, this whole topic relates the body systems, the organ systems like digestion, or the digestive system, to health. So if you think about this, when we eat, we can eat slightly too much and we can then store that as fat and we can become overweight. So that can then lead to impacts on our health. So what we then need to be able to do is detect whether someone is overweight or not, or whether they're a healthy weight. So this is what we use BMI for, what's called body mass index. So a body mass index is used to determine whether someone is a healthy weight. So you can do a calculation, and if a person's BMI is over the number 30, they are then classed as what's known as obese. Now, if a person is labelled obese, that means that they basically need to be losing weight to become more healthy. So what we can then do is we can advise them to do a couple of things. So if someone is far more overweight than they should be for their height and their size, what we'd advise them to do is to regularly exercise. Okay, so when they regularly exercise, that'll help them to reduce their weight. And they're also advised to improve their diet. Now you can improve your diet in a couple of ways to reduce obesity and to try and bring your weight back down to a healthy level. So you can reduce both fats and reduce sugar in your diet. So you need to know how to determine whether someone is obese, and you need to basically figure out how to calculate BMI in the first place. So the BMI calculation requires two pieces of information. You need to know the person's weight, and that weight is measured in kilograms. Now I know that some people measure their weight in stones, but for this calculation we use kilograms. And then we need to know their height. And we need to know their height in meters. Now, as part of this calculation, you need to make their height into meters squared. Now I'll show you how to do that in a wee moment. So I'm going to give you a couple of worked examples just to show you how this BMI calculation works. I'm going to give you one with a normal weight or a normal BMI, and then I'm going to give you one that is an obese person, a person that is a higher BMI than it should be. So we have example A. And that person's weight is going to be, we'll say 56 kilograms. And we're going to say their height is 1.57 meters. So to calculate this, what you'll need to do is then find out what their meter squared height is. So what you need to do is times that height by itself. So we would have 56 kilograms divided by their height in meters squared. So you would have to do 1.57 times 1.57 to get that height in meters squared. Now that answer of 1.57 times 1.57 will give you 2.4649. Okay, so we're then going to then have our 56 kilograms divided by our 2.4649. When we do that calculation, we do 56 divided by this number here, we then get a number of 22.72, and that is this person's BMI. Now this, you'll notice, isn't over 30, so therefore this person is a healthy weight. Okay, so to give you another example of how to work this out, we'll do example B. Now I'm going to say that this person has a weight of 89.6 kilograms, and they have a height of, we'll say 1.6 meters. So if their weight is 89.6, we'll pop that in the top of our calculation. And then what you have to do is find their height in meters squared. So you would do 1.6 times 1.6. Okay, so when you do that calculation, you'll get a number which I'll need to calculate just now. And then what you'll get eventually is your number for your BMI, which will be 35. Okay, so this person's BMI is 35. That means that they have a BMI that is over 30. Okay, and because their BMI is over 30, that person is classed as obese. Okay, and just to get that number for you, that number would be 2.56. So to calculate that, then you would do 89.6 divided by that 2.56, which is 1.6 times itself. Okay, and that would give you your obesity number, or your BMI number of 35, which shows that that person is obese. Okay, now there's a practice sheet in the Google Classroom which will show you some examples to use from The Simpsons, and that will help you then to calculate BMI for those people. Okay, so that summarises what digestion is, what the structures of the digestive system are, and how to calculate BMI as well.